My name is Dr. Catherine Quinlan. I'm assistant professor in science education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. And prior to entering into academia, I've spent years training myself to be interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary in my approach because I believe that many of the issues we face today are complex and require integrated approaches. I'm currently funded by the National Science Foundation to create products for cultural representation and more specifically for Black representation in the science curriculum. However, today I'm going to focus on a different area of my research related to self-efficacy and indicators of persistence in science, and more so in biology. So today I'm going to talk about getting to know yourself and understand others. I chose this topic because as faculty, we bring ourselves into our classrooms and all that that means and carries with it. I've had to continuously confront my own sense of self in order to reorient myself in my various classrooms. And this was important because as a Black person, my background was different from those of my science peers in college and those of my students. I grew up very sheltered and very protected and did not grow up in an environment where I continuously felt the call to prove myself because I was Black or because I am Black. As a result, my interactions and my reactions were salient to me as much as my experiences were internal. I was not conditioned to either internally accept or respond or react in a certain way. So, as I've sought to continuously adapt to my own classroom, I've come to see that we can use our identity to connect or disconnect with others. And this usually determines whether or not others feel like they belong or they don't belong. And so before I delve into this talk and share different kinds of data that I think relate to identity, I want to ask a few reflective questions. Where do you have you felt like you belonged? And where have you felt like you didn't belong? I'll never forget the day I decided not to major in chemistry. I remember where I was. I remember how I felt. I was walking out of chemistry building. It was a beautiful sunny day. I actually remember this very vividly, literally up to the fact that it was sunny and I was passing by a part of the lawn of my college in front of a library that I used to sit or lay in the grass and do chemistry problems. Because chemistry came very easy to me. I got an easy A. But I decided not to major in chemistry because I didn't want to be alone or constantly feel lonely. I was in a lab sometimes after 6, like most of you know, in organic lab. But I don't remember ever speaking to anyone. My biology experience, I have to say, so most of you are in biology, was worse. I decided to major in English while fulfilling all of the pre-med requirements because I told myself that this is my weaker subject. In hindsight, I think it was because I would hoped I would feel like more like I belonged. My mom was an English teacher and a writer. And in college, I remember that the only English course I remember was Writers of the Anglophone Caribbean. And coincidentally, I think Professor Kasanoff might be the only professor I remember by name other than my advisor. Belonging is very challenging for people of color, especially for Blacks. And unfortunately, I believe that being in science or STEM in general only deepens that pain and sense of not belonging and lonely experience. In addition, there is an identity that is attached to being a STEM major. In your case, in the biological science, it's an identity created by the field. In science education, we talk about science identity. And many of the studies have shown that it's especially challenging for African Americans and Native Americans, American students, to identify as scientists, even if they have high self-efficacy. So identity in science is problematic. And my goal in this talk is for you to make the connection between your own identity in general, possibly your science identity and belonging for you and belonging for your students. So something to consider, do you use your identity to connect or disconnect with students? And which identity do you attribute the most to your sense of self? According to Guy, researcher Guy, our identity can fit into 4 categories in how we define ourselves. And these are nature identity, institution identity, discourse identity, and affinity identity. And according to Guy, it doesn't mean we belong in one or will necessarily just always identify with one. He indicates that this is fluid. These categories are fluid. We can move back and forth in different amounts. So I'm going to touch on just one or two, more or less two actually, but not get as much depth because of time. But consider, which do you most identify with your source of power? Your nature identity, according to B, is who you are, the kind of person you are, and your nature is your source of your power and not society in his research. In other words, you are smart and intelligent. It's who you are, and others recognize that in you because you've accomplished XYZ and gained what you need to be recognized as smart. But where do our perceptions about our nature come from? And why do we think the way we do? I remember when I taught high school biology, I would hear colleagues making comments about our students, such as why don't they assimilate? We did, and we became a melting pot. So I was curious about where these perceptions came from before I entered academia. And so it led me to Nell Irving Painter's book, The History of White People. And one set of data she looked at stuck with me. And so I went and looked at it for myself. And it's interesting to see historically how many of us and how many of you we've come to define ourselves based on how we're categorized by institutions and by government. And often we have defined our nature as such. And even starting in 1790, you get to see that they're free white males. Why do we need to specify that they're free? Free white males, if you look at the categories at the top, 15 years and up, heads of family, then we have free white males under 16, and then there's one category for free white females, and then all other free people and slaves. So who else? Who is in this category? Okay. It's not just black slaves. Then when we go from 1790, we jump to 1850. We see that it's important to identify by country, right? And some groups from these countries were known for something negative, right? They were shamed for something negative, and there were big prejudices against those who did not speak English. Of course, I always ask different questions. How deep was the shame associated with these negative attributes? And how far did it go? Today, being an immigrant is actually, we see it's a trigger. It's a trigger, and the shame associated with this trigger can be used to manipulate people. And some popular notions back then, people used to think that many Native Americans did better with Spanish, right? We used to say, there was a saying I heard that the Spanish married them and the English killed them. And this was a saying. These were things people said back then. Hence, you have Mexico, which were among the natives. But one of the things I've learned by delving into the history through this NSF project was that the blacks did initially flee south. I know a lot of us think that blacks initially fled north because we're taught to think that. But I don't know how many of you knew they fled south first because that's where they were being free first. Later on, we come to see that you're just as foreign if you came from a different state. The USA wasn't thought as this whole in the way we think of it today. People identified much more with their home states. So if you were from Virginia, you didn't have as great an affinity from someone from Massachusetts. Or you might think someone from New York was foreign. So the question is, if you go to 1860 and you look at the new categories later on, you have white. All of those categories, everybody's lumped here. You have free colored, and then you have slave over here on the right side, black and mulatto. So if we were all a melting pot, these categories would have to go away, wouldn't they? We don't see images like this anymore. We don't really talk about this, whites who were slaves or indentured servants. And so the question always remains, how deep is the shame and how many triggers does this have? Sometimes we view others to be smart just because they are white, or not smart just because they're not white. And these ideas are deeply ingrained, and many of us don't know where it came from. But a great deal of research has been done in science education to describe attributes, especially attributes we've used to define blacks and whites. So some questions to consider. What are attributes you use or have used or used to use to define blacks? What are some attributes you've used or have used to define whites that are inherent to you? For many of us, the last couple of years has been a wake-up call and somewhat discouraging. Not so much just because of the politics, but because you probably became a little confused about or began to think that maybe you need to redefine who you are. And the last few years might have been a blow to to what you believed you are based on how you've defined yourself relative to others. Black people know a lot about the need to redefine ourselves constantly. I'm going to talk briefly about discourse identity. In discourse identity, he talks about your power being your discourse. Your discourse, the dialogue that is recognized by others. For example, in your interactions and discourse with others, you're recognized as attentive, charismatic, intelligent, and it could be by a teacher. And these have led to accumulation of your achievements. Now, discourse identity came up quite a bit on my trip in my NSF funded project to the Gullah Geechee Islands in South Carolina, off the coast of South Carolina. One of the things that came up was they were ridiculed constantly for the way they talked. And we see some of this portrayed in some of the movies we see. But today, and it hasn't been that many years ago, just I would say about less than 10 actually. Being Gullah Geechee became more popular and accepted. And I believe it's because of the Heritage Act that helped preserve their heritage and made being Gullah more profitable. So much so that if you go down there, you'll hear some whites identify with being Gullah and calling themselves Gullah and saying that they're selling authentic Gullah products. We see this issue of discourse even in Africa today when we talk about language, where you have African students being told not to speak their own language. We often forget that people do better in learning languages when they're fluent in speaking their own. And we often don't see the benefit of including other languages or other voices or perspectives. And we see this in STEM quite a bit. Language has often been used to exercise power, to regulate, to control, to dominate, to manipulate. But there are several questions to consider, especially when it comes to your own science classroom. How much do you feel you would need to adapt, to engage in an exchange of ideas with someone who is not like you? How interesting are their ideas to you? It's especially difficult when people talk about things that you're absolutely not interested in. But you need to keep in mind that with a disconnect, your students are just as interested in your ideas as you are in theirs. And again, to what extent does your identity help you to connect or disconnect? Is part of your identity simply not to be as interested in anyone else's identity? Is part of agency simply to be absorbed, self-absorbed? And what forms would connecting take for you? I always picture myself standing at my chemistry professor's doorway and looking at him, and him looking at me. It was just awkward and strange. I honestly don't remember why I went to see him. I got A's in all his courses. And I honestly don't remember if it was the first semester or second semester or when I was about to declare. But perhaps I'm just remembering how coming to see him made me feel. But the message was clear when I left that office, whether it was 16 or 17 or 18 years old. I probably was 18. I didn't belong. In hindsight, it was the best decision I made for myself to feel like I belong, especially when I hear about challenges that others have. And so I'm glad that I put my energies to develop in areas where I felt like I belong. For many of us, we have an identity crisis, especially related to science, a period of distress or confusion about our goals or character. And you have an identity crisis when our nature identity might conflict with our institution identity or an affinity identity or a discoursed identity. That connection, acceptance is important in making sure that I'm appropriately mentored in the biological field. How could you possibly mentor me if you don't even want to talk to me? How could you possibly be a good mentor and help me develop in the way I want to? Not only in the way you want to, if you're not interested in what I have to say. How could I possibly be a part of a scientific community of practice if I'm sitting across the table from someone who doesn't want to hear me? And so these are feelings I've had and I think about when I think about these awkward interactions. I sometimes even ask if it was a black guy, would it have been easier to talk to him? I don't know. Maybe not. But I like to ask different questions. If it was a black guy, would he have reached out to me? Would he have attempted to connect? I can tell you from experience and knowing students in doctoral programs in science and STEM, many of our black doctorates graduate without publishing, while their white doctorates would publish. And sometimes they've sat at the same table and their names may not be put on a publication, even if they've done the same thing, the same work, sitting there at the table because of your affinity for them. Unfortunately, we don't have time to delve into affinity identity. You see, no one can force you to be a good mentor to students if you don't want to. Because if you don't want to or required to, then what happens is that people pretend to be a good mentor. But we'll know as students because we see what others are getting and what we're not. And so the challenging it the challenges does result in conflicts. I want to end by hoping that your takeaway today is to use your identity to connect rather than to disconnect. This is going to benefit you as a mentor and it will benefit your students. And you never know what you'll learn from them. Learning to connect will also improve connection at work, at home, and in our society. The connection we don't make and realize is we often, sometimes we're disconnected at home as well. If we don't connect well or love the person at home, I shouldn't say love, I don't want to use the word. If we don't allow, let's just say, a woman at home to have a voice, I'm not sure how I would expect you to allow me as a Black woman to have a voice. And so, my call to action is to practice connecting with a Black undergraduate student on your campus. The next time you go on campus, practice connecting with a Black undergraduate student. Thank you. Questions?
Catherine, thank you so much for that thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. That was fantastic. We do have some questions in the chat. So let me just scroll through. So I think the one I'd like to start out with is maybe one looking for some practical advice. So can you suggest either an approach you've taken or exercises that you might recommend for STEM students who are just starting off in college to explore and potentially strengthen their science identity?
Wow. Sure. So one of the most helpful approaches, I'm working in a U.S. Department of Ed funded project, and in this project, because we've hired mentors, student mentors, to work with students, and we've done other strategies. For example, I gave lectures and activities and learning strategies, but it's amazing to see the impact of peer mentoring because students feel much more comfortable asking each other questions that they wouldn't want to ask a professor. And I mean, the peer mentors have gone above and beyond just connecting, being there. They've even been in the lab, sometimes helping a lot in the lab, answering questions. So I think peer mentoring is really important because what has come out of that is are conversations that I would not have realized were happening. And sometimes it didn't even have to do with biology. It had to do with just adjusting to academic life. And it was really helpful for students to hear the difficulty, the challenges that other peers had and what they did. So they didn't have to feel like they were alone. So peer mentoring is absolutely important and helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that. That makes so much sense. That power dynamic that exists between instructors and students came to mind when you were mentioning, would your situation in college have been different had your chemistry professor been a Black man? So to think about how just that natural dynamic, the power dynamic that exists with students in a classroom plays into things, I think is really
Absolutely.
important. Yeah, thank you
Hmm.
for that. So how can we learn to accept people's dispositions when they are not like ours? Or how can we help other people acknowledge this? It bothers me when I hear colleagues say that students seem uninterested. I ask them not to use this term.
Right. It's so interesting you said that because I can relate and understand and completely relate to that perspective. But here's the difference. So one of the challenges that I've observed is empathy. And the truth is, it was a challenge for me as well because I'm teaching science and I have a science background, but I'm also teaching to non-science, right? Because I'm in the Department of Curriculum Instruction preparing non-science majors. And so when I think I've been doing all of these adjustments, and even though, and students were interested in the work and doing better and just really enjoying things. But the biggest move I made that allowed me to tap into who I was, to connect on a deeper level, was really to understand on a deeper level what was holding me back. A lot of times we don't realize that we carry with us this shell, and this shell is often created by negative shaming experiences that are buried there. And so I believe the more of those experiences we have, the bigger the shell. And I think one of the things you might even want to ask is, what has been your experience to your colleague? Because I found that people's people's because people don't want to look at themselves, they focus so much on the negativity and attach that negativity to others. And so the biggest thing I would say to connect is to help that colleague to connect with her own lack of interest, because we often think we're more interesting than we are. And the only thing honestly is we've got to start looking at ourselves, even if it's really hard, because that will never change if we don't start looking at ourselves.
Thank you. We are actually right at the end of our time, so I'm going to have to wrap us up right now. Again, thank you so much. This was such a great day way to start off our day today, and I think you've given us so much to have in our heads as we work through the rest of today. So again, thank you so much for being here and being part of our community. Everyone, all attendees, I'd like to encourage you to join us in our next session with Pearson. You can find the link for that on your agenda. And have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.